establishing Eric Bischoff as this guy that come over like this humble servant coming over from the AWA and reinventing WCW. He really did. He did a lot of innovative stuff, had a ton of great ideas, and I think that early, like a lot of those 1994 WCW on into whenever he left, he had a ton of great ideas during that time. Ultimately, obviously failed, but we do have to give the devil his due a little bit. He did bring over a bunch of great ideas, but they're establishing the characters, but they're not really like pointing the finger just yet. And I think maybe that's what the audience was wanting. They're wanting like everybody on camera in unison to say that Eric Bischoff killed WCW, when really, you're going to get a wide variety of opinions there. And I think the only guy that was willing to say that was Bret Hart. He was like very matter-of-factly about it, like say, yeah, it was Bischoff.
Bret don't care. And like Bret's the only guy who doesn't give a flying fuck about trying to stay in the WWE's good graces. Bret could care less. So here's my qualm with all this: is the vibe that I got off the show is it felt like the Eric Bischoff reclamation project. Right now, I could be wrong. I could be at the end of the day, they are going to paint Bischoff as the guy who was responsible for it. But the fact that he's so directly involved with the production, and the fact that the Dark Side guys have slipped a little bit over the years as far as how they cover these things, and they're now part of the system. They're not guys that operate outside the system now. Like they're firmly entrenched in it.
So JD, Eric Bischoff had a podcast last week, or I think it was earlier this week. Might have been Monday. Guess who his two guests were?
That's what I thought.
Yeah, Brian Gewirtz. It was Brian Gewirtz and one of the Dark Side guys. I can't remember if it was Evan Husney or it was the other guy.
Yeah, I don't like it. So I mean, and this is the vibe. This is the vibe that you get off of it. And Eric has very much tried to defend himself as being the guy responsible for it, because quite frankly, he's the guy responsible for it. He killed WCW.
I think he's the main culprit. A lot of people contributed to it, but I think
sure.
He's patient zero. It's kind of like, Ken Burns had that old quote about, how a lot of people in the South were trying to say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. And he was like, a lot of things contributed to the Civil War, I'm sorry. But one thing caused it, and it was slavery. A lot of things contributed to the death of WCW, and one thing caused it. It was Eric Bischoff's mismanagement. Right. Mm-hmm. That was the initial, like the free fall without a parachute started on his watch, his lack of leadership, his lack of foresight, and essentially losing control of the company. It started with him, with all the people that he had hired, and they were losing tens of millions of dollars on his watch. And then of course, a bunch of bad decisions ultimately led to the death, but it was on his watch.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on this, because the company had been in free fall from its inception until Eric Bischoff comes in, and it still takes a couple years for it not to be in free fall. WCW was a money loser for all but 2 years of its existence.
Yeah,
all but 3 years of its existence. Excuse me. So, like, the fact that you have to give him credit for one, sticking to his plan, because he takes over in '93. And it's not until 96 that they start, turning things around. It took a long time. And like a lot of that was, I believe it was you who praised them for, and it was one of our text threads. You praised them for the Disney move, which saved them a lot of money, made for some really bad TV.
Yeah, and I thought it was a brilliant move, getting them off of the road. We actually talked about it. We didn't talk about WCW doing it on the podcast on the Mike and JD show, but we've been talking about TNA possibly doing that, kind of going back to their roots and going back to an Impact Zone type of setting, or Full Sail University. AEW moving Collision to Arlington, coming up with a residency for the next couple of months. And we're praising them. Well, not that he came up with the idea. Studio Wrestling has been around forever, but he had the foresight to take WCW off of the road because they're a money loser and move them to Disney MGM Studios. And the show looked great, well lit, always had a fresh audience. That part was great. But again, it also led, he could not manage it well enough because they were shooting, 5-6 times a day, doing months in advance. And like, it really had a negative impact on the overall storytelling of the show.
Yeah. The show sucked. Right, like worldwide, it worked. Like they filled their syndication. It really helps tell the fan base that syndicated WCW television didn't matter, right? And it was decisions like this that I think eventually did kill like syndicated wrestling in general, because it's in the early, because remember, back in the 80s, syndication was the prime. That's where everything happened. The one exception was WCW.